So do turn back to 1 Peter and chapter 3, and we'll be looking at these first 7 verses. Remember, we've been looking through 1 Peter over this year to date, and back in the summer at some point we looked at the instructions in that first part we read at the end of chapter 2. Peter is, here he's explained at the start of the letter about the hope that the Christians he's writing to have, and who they are, and how they are God's special people. And now he's explaining to them what it's going to look like to live as God's special people in a world which generally doesn't acknowledge Christ. As he says at the start of chapter 2, Jesus is like the stone the builders rejected. He's not part of the architecture. What it's going to look like to live in a world like that, as he says a few times, as exiles, as people whose home is somewhere else, who don't really fit into the culture around you, but are still very much part of the world we're living in anyway. The people Peter's writing to originally are scattered around ancient Turkey, living in a very pagan society. Today here we're scattered around Sidcup in a partially pagan society, and so what Peter has to say to them 2,000 years ago nearly is still very relevant to us today. Here in chapter 3, Peter's focus, if you want to sort of sum up what he's saying we need to be like, he says we need to be fearlessly gentle. To be fearlessly gentle. You look at his description of how wives should be. They should have gentle spirits, but at the same time not fearing anything that is frightening. And he goes on to use similar terms later in the chapter, where he's talking about how to make a defense of the hope that's in you, to do it with gentleness and respect, but at the same time and not to fear, to have no fear of them, nor to be troubled. How can we live in a way which is fearlessly gentle in the world around us? So the context is that we're chosen exiles, living distinct lives in a pagan society. So we're surrounded by people who are very different, who at least we should be very different from, because our hope is somewhere else. We're not living for the same things. And people, when faced with difference, usually our natural response is to fear, isn't it? Or to attack. People fear or attack things that are different from them. But here is something, a combination which is fundamentally and radically different. Instead of attacking, you're fundamentally gentle. Instead of fearing, you are fearless. So we're going to look today at how he applies this to wives and to husbands specifically. What should a fearlessly gentle marriage look like? And there's 3 things here, 2 main instructions to wives and then 1 to husbands as well. And there'll be lessons running through this for all of us. If you're not a wife or a husband here today, hopefully you'll see how it's relevant to you, but also how you can help other wives and husbands around you to live more like this. So the first thing is how to be winning. How to be winning. Verses 1 and 2. Likewise, wives, be subject to your husbands. Is an instruction for wives. Be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct, Peter says to them. He says, how are you going to be winning towards your husband? He says, well, you're going to be subject to him. And he says, this is likewise. He's already been talking about what it's like to be subject earlier in this chapter, about what it's like to honor the emperor and to be subject to human institutions, about what it's like for servants to be subject to their masters. And here's a different and quite a different way of being subject. Wives are to be subject to their own husbands. This, Paul says, is going to stand out as different, as radically different. What Paul is not doing here is he's not perpetuating the cultural norms of his time. He's not going, well, look around at families around me, I see wives who are subject to their husbands, and it'd be a good thing to write that, or Peter rather, it'd be a good thing to write that down in this book. Peter's not doing that. He's not setting out to perpetuate cultural norms. The whole point of this letter is that Peter wants his readers to start behaving radically differently from everyone around them. He's not saying try to blend in, he's saying do everything you can to stand out. He's describing a culture here and a family, a marriage, which is to be fearlessly distinct from any norms of any time. You notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, which might have been quite acceptable in his day, husbands, make sure you keep your wives in order. That's not what he says, is it? I'm not standing up here saying, husbands, make sure you keep your wives in order. That's not what Peter says. He doesn't say, which would be popular in our day, wives, assert your independence and ignore what your husband says because you're your own boss. He doesn't blend in with the culture of his day or the culture of our day. And instead of saying, think, what do you want to get out of it? How can I arrange things my way? He says, wives, set out from your side, personally, to be subject to your husbands. That's going to be radically distinct. You're not waiting for your husband to beat it into you, and you're not saying, well, I'm going to assert my independence. You are setting out proactively to say, what can I do to be subject to my husband? Vice versa, his instruction for husbands in verse 7 is again radically distinct from any human culture. He says, husbands, don't say, what do I want to get out of marriage? What's in it for me? Actually set out, he says, to show honor to your wife. And we'll look at that when we come on to that later. So he's picturing this marriage where the wife is setting out to be subject to her husband, and the husband is setting out to honor his wife as something which is going to be radically distinct and show a difference, to show that husband and wife are living as exiles. Now, of course, he says some wives, your husbands may not obey the word. They may not be Christians. They may not acknowledge Christ as Lord. But if that's the case, your behavior in submitting to them will still be a very attractive thing. It will still be a very winning thing. There's lots of things you can do to attract people to you. But he says if you want to be winning, this is the way to do it. Set out to be subject to your own husbands. And of course the point here is not to be winning your husband over to you. You trust that your husband already loves you and is won over to you, that's why he married you. But also to win them over to Christ, to show them something of what Christ does in you. That you're not setting out to live for yourself, but in everything you're living for other people, and you're living in your marriage to be subject to your husband. Paul talks about how he, in his preaching and in his ministry, he sets out he says in every way I want to win some, and he changes how he behaves to different people. He says to Jews I live as a Jew, to Gentiles he lives as a Gentile, and he does that so that in his behavior, in the way he acts towards people, he's able to win some. And he does that, in his case, he's making sure he doesn't put blockers in the way of the Jews by, going to the Jews' house and eating pork or something, or inviting them round and eating pork. Paul is changing his behavior, and he's been careful how he behaves, because he wants to show how his Christian faith and his Christian life makes him care more about them than about himself. And this is what Peter is saying here to wives. Show that you care more about your husbands than about you. Show that you're putting them first in your marriage. Paul does that, he says, for the gospel's sake, to save some. And that's the purpose here as well. Wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, there may be one without a word by the conduct of their wives. He says that you can win them without a word. There's nothing less attractive than a wife that just keeps on nagging you. I'm sure everyone's aware. And sometimes it's time not to just not to say things. Your husband knows what you believe. What's going to be most winning is simply to show in your life the way that you love him by submitting to him. Now, the thing here that Peter's emphasizing is wife's conduct, and this idea of how you conduct yourself has been a big theme all the way through Peter's letter. He's writing this to help these scattered Christians around ancient Turkey, understand how they should be conducting themselves. And he's saying that this will be a really exemplary thing in a wife. When she's submitting to her husband, what will he see? He says they'll see, verse 2, your respectful and your pure conduct. There's something there which is respectful and pure about everything that you're doing and the way that you're acting towards them. This holy conduct, we've seen it all the way through. 1 verse 15, Peter says, as he who calls you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. 1 verse 18, he says, you were ransomed from the futile ways or futile conduct inherited from your forefathers. So there's been this real change in how you conduct your life. 2 verse 12 that we read at the beginning, he says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honourable, or literally good, doing good to people, so that even when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. And then here in the verses we've just read, even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. And Peter, at the end of his second letter, he sort of sums up what his two letters have been about in 2 Peter 3, verse 11. And he says to them, think, since all the things you see around you are going to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? And that holy conduct is a really central theme throughout this first letter. So, wives, how can you show holy conduct? Well, start by submitting to your husbands respectfully and purely. His point is not that somehow they'll work out the gospel from your actions, but they know the gospel, and your actions may well be what persuades them that there's something in it. So the first thing is be winning. Be winning. It's a great thing to know how to be if you're a wife or if you're a husband. Secondly, he says, be beautiful. Be beautiful in verses 3 down to 6. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. What is it that makes you beautiful, he says, wives? He takes it for granted that the wives are beautiful, and what is it that makes you beautiful? Well, it's not, he says, the things that people see on the outside. It's well known that those things come and they go, don't they, and they change over time. That, he says, is not to be what adorns you. That's not meant to be your primary source of beauty. And now he lists things here, doesn't he? He says braiding of your hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear. Are these all things you might do in order to make yourself beautiful? He's not saying that it's wrong to do that. He's not saying you must not braid your hair or you mustn't wear gold jewelry any more than he's saying you mustn't wear clothes. But his point is that that's not what your beauty is meant to come from. It's not that, how am I going to be beautiful? Well, I put on my best dress and my best jewelry and braid my hair in the most beautiful way, and that will make me beautiful. He says your beauty is to come from somewhere else, somewhere which is lasting and somewhere which is different. What is hidden, he says, but which is very much in God's sight, and which God sees. And which your husband will see, and which other people will see as they look at your marriage and how you relate to each other. Let's just read that part again. He says, it's not to be these things, but let your adorning, verse 4, be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. It's hidden, he says, but it's in God's sight, and it's very precious to him. And he says what this beauty is it comes from, he says, a gentle and a quiet spirit. Here's this gentleness, which is meant to characterize how God's people relate to the people around them. And that gentleness, he says, should be what you're working on in your heart to make yourself more beautiful. More beautiful to your husband, to people around you, but also more beautiful to God, who looks at the heart. God sees straight through the fancy clothes or the jewelry or whatever else it is. He sees what you're like inside, and this is precious to him, as well as being a beautiful thing to the people around you. A gentle and quiet spirit is how Peter describes it. In God's sight, this is very precious. Also, he says it's not only that it's very precious, it doesn't perish. It doesn't perish. Your best dress will perish one day, and so will your gold jewelry eventually. But here's something which doesn't perish: the imperishable beauty, he says, of a gentle and quiet spirit. We've been thinking already in 1 Peter about things which are imperishable. That's where our hope is to be. Our hope is to be on things which are imperishable, because, as we touched on quickly this morning, God is giving us an inheritance. Chapter 1, verse 4, an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you. God is keeping that inheritance for us. He's keeping it for you, if you're one of his people. And in that inheritance, your clothes and your jewelry and your braided hair and whatever isn't going to matter, but your beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit is going to be part of that. It's going to be there. It's going to still be there in that imperishable inheritance that God's giving to you. And so it's not only something which is more valuable now, but something which will actually last and which will be your beauty for eternity. Why is this? How do we know this is a good thing to do? Well, Peter says this is how all the holy people, all the holy women of the Old Testament, this is what they did. This is how they lived their lives and how they made themselves beautiful. Verse 5. This is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves. He says, by submitting to their own husbands. He takes the example of Sarah, who, he says, obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. The time he's referring to, Sarah isn't calling him Lord to look impressive or to impress him. At the time, she doesn't think anyone's listening. She's in the tent, and she's having a laugh because someone has just told Abraham he's going to have a baby, and she goes, that's ridiculous. I'm old, my Lord's old as well. It was just how she thought of Abraham. She thought of him respectfully in a way that she was subject to him. And she intentionally did that in order to honor him and in order to submit herself to God and the way that God had put things together. So he said, this is what the holy women used to do to adorn themselves. They're examples to follow. And think for yourself what it is you're hoping for. Is your hope, as Peter's been telling us, is it aligned to what will be revealed when Christ returns, the grace that will be revealed at that time? Or is your hope set on other things like getting your own way, getting your own things out of, getting your own desires out of, etc., your marriage and the situation you're in? Yeah, and that's a question for both husbands and wives, as we'll see. What is it that your hope is set on? The point that Peter's making, just to sum up here for wives, and as he sums up now in verse 7 or verse 6, he's saying to them, don't be afraid to live in a way which is contrary to the culture around you. Don't be afraid to live in a way that is different from the culture around you. He says that you're Sarah's children, he says, you're the next generation of holy women. If you do good, remember that's what he's already told all believers they should be doing good to everyone. If you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening, don't be afraid to live differently. Don't be afraid, he says, to live distinctly and in a way which will make people laugh at you or a way that will make people say that you're an idiot. The bravest actions, Peter says, of God's elect exiles, the bravest things that are done, he says, are carried out by wives and husbands as well at home as they gently and patiently, but particularly gently, live changed, submissive lives from the wife's side and honouring lives from the husband's side, in a culture which mocks that and which thinks that is worthless and that is just devaluing yourself. Now, it may be a different culture when Peter's writing. It may be that you have the people around you think that your husband should be beating you into submission. I don't know. Maybe even your husband does in that culture. Obviously, you have situations of this today as well. But in that culture, it can be a scary thing to do, to set out to submit yourself to your husband. You're making yourself a target. Is it going to cause you problems? But in our culture, it's a scary thing to do, isn't it? Because if you're doing that openly and people know that you're doing that, and you're acknowledging that without sort of rolling your eyes at the same time, then what sort of abuse are you going to get from people around you for voluntarily submitting to your husband or voluntarily honouring your wife above yourself? You're going to stand out and you're going to be different, and people are going to go, what an idiot she is. Why doesn't she stand up for her rights and tell him to get lost? Why is she submitting to him in that? The people in Peter's time and the people he's writing to, the big threat they're facing at this particular point is not that they're likely to be thrown to the lions, or that they're likely to be burned at the stake, or any of these other things that have happened to Christians down history and still happen to Christians today. But it's the very scary thing of they're going to stand out, and they're going to be unacceptable in the culture which doesn't like what they're doing. Peter's writing this against a backdrop of a culture which says you can do as you like. You can do what you want with your life. You want to go out and get drunk, and you want to be immoral, go and do it. It's fine. It's great. That's what everyone does. And a culture which is going to vigorously speak against anyone who doesn't join in that, and anyone who doesn't fit in with it. Not to give any spoilers, but to just skip ahead in chapter 4, Peter describes what's happening in verse 4 of chapter 4. He says, with respect to this is them going off in parties and sexual immorality and all of that. He says, the people around you, they're surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. That's the sort of opposition that Peter's readers are facing. People are saying, you could have so much fun in life if you weren't a Christian, if you didn't live like this. And that's what people are going to be saying to wives who set out to be subject to their husbands. So people are going to say to husbands who set out to honour their wives above themselves. And one of the scariest things in life is standing out, isn't it? And doing that not in a way that shows you as a strong and powerful character. That can be quite attractive, can't it? I'm going to stand out, and I'm going to show everyone how strong and powerful I am. But actually standing out in a way which is gentle and which is vulnerable and which shows you as gentle and vulnerable. That's a scary thing to do. It's a scary thing to do. Peter says, you are Sarah's children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Don't be afraid, he says, but intentionally and deliberately keep doing what is good. Keep doing good to your husband. Keep doing good, conversely, we'll come on to a second, to your wife. Keep doing good to the people around you, regardless of how it's received, regardless of what might scare you. This, he says, is what's being modelled supremely here by Christian wives, and including wives whose husbands don't obey the word, but those who do as well. All Christian wives are modelling what it looks like to live in a way which is fearlessly gentle in a society which really doesn't appreciate that and which speaks against it. And Peter is going to go on, as I said, to apply the same principle to how we defend the faith, and we'll see that, God willing, next time. But the example for that, the example for how we defend the faith, and the example for how we live fearlessly, gently, distinctly in a pagan world is seen, first and foremost, in the way that Christian wives behave towards their husbands. Let's go on to the third point, okay, and this is where he's addressing specifically the husbands. We've seen be winning, be beautiful. The husbands, he says, be understanding. Be understanding. Having displayed the life of a Christian wife as a model of fearless gentleness, Peter comes to the husbands, and he says to them, behave likewise. There's that word likewise is there again. Again, for husbands, there's going to be something very similar to the wives. Right, the wives are submitting themselves to the husbands, That's not the husbands aren't also submitting themselves to the wives, but they have the same attitude in that they're setting out to do what is good and not being frightened of the attitudes of people around them, and they're first and foremost setting out to do what is good to their wives. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honour to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Behave likewise. He says, prioritize understanding the needs of your wife and understand how to do what's best for her rather than what's best for you. We can be very good as men at knowing what's best for us and trying to get it. But he says, understand what's best for her. Understand her. Live with her in an understanding way. Men and women are different, aren't they? And when men and women's needs are different. And husbands, from experience, don't always put the effort in to understand what their wives really need and understand what's best for their wives. But the point here is that you too as a husband need to be and are going to be focused on what is best for your wife, not what's best for yourself. And as you do that, you are going to stand out as different. You are going to be living out your marriage together, the Christian wife, the Christian husband, in fearless gentleness, as you put each other's needs before your own. The wife sets out intentionally to be subject to her husband, and the husband sets out intentionally to understand his wife's needs and to honour her. And there's the second thing here, is to show honour. Live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honour to the woman, he says, as the weaker vessel. The word honour is literally to value. Show her value. Show that you value her. Honour her. It's the same as you're meant to be doing to the king in the previous chapter. You honour the king. You show the king's value as the head of state. You show the woman's value, and you show her honour. But Peter points out that she's the weaker vessel, and it's not always true, but women are generally weaker than men. That's why you have men's races and women's races, and you don't have them competing in the same sport. Physically weaker, that is. The idea of the vessel is that's your body, bodily less strong. But Peter says actually that means greater honour. I think the idea of a vessel here, it's literally a pot or something. You have a sort of rough and ready stoneware pot, and then you've got a sort of fine china pot. And the fine china pot's worth a lot more than the rough and ready stoneware pot. It's more beautiful, it's worth more, it's less physically strong, but it has this honour. And that's the sort of picture that he's using here. And so he says, set out to show honour to your wife, show that you honour her. That's going to affect how you act, isn't it, towards her. It's going to affect how you speak about her, to her face and behind her back, and when you're with your friends and whatever. It's going to affect how you prioritise her needs if you're setting out intentionally to really honour and value her. And you, as well, if your wife is a Christian who is setting out to be like Sarah, to do good and not fear anything that is frightening, you should be honouring that. Honour your wife as she fearlessly and gently takes on a hostile world, wherever she is, in the home, at work, down the street, at the shops, wherever she's intentionally living out a Christian life. Now, Peter says there's two reasons for this. There's two reasons why husbands should be doing this. And one is a sort of a cause reason, and one of it is a warning reason. As he says, the cause of this should be that because they are heirs with you. They are heirs with you. A Christian couple are both exiles. They're exiles together, chosen exiles, as Peter calls them. They belong somewhere else. But they're also heirs together. They have an inheritance together. They both have an equal inheritance in the kingdom that God has prepared for them. It's not an inheritance which goes only to the men, as in the Old Testament generally the inheritance of Israel passed from the father to the son. And there are obvious reasons for that. If you had then bits of it going to the daughters, they married another family, you'd end up with a real mess sorting out the inheritance. But you do have this one instance where who was the guy in Numbers who had only daughters? Zelophehad, isn't it? Zelophehad had only daughters, and they went to Moses and they said, what's going to happen to the inheritance? Can we have it? Because otherwise our father's inheritance is going to disappear. And God was very clear that inheritance was very important, and that stayed in the families and it passed down, and they're an example there of the inheritance passing on to the daughters. Just read the verse from Numbers 27, verse 7. Like Zelophehad, he knew how I felt living in a house full of girls. Numbers 27, verse 7. The Lord said to Moses, "The daughters of Zelophehad are right. You shall give them possession of an inheritance among their father's brothers, and transfer the inheritance of their father to them." They're to have inheritance among the brothers, and Jesus' inheritance is like that for everyone. The daughters have inheritance among the brothers, and so he says, you and your wife are fellow heirs of the inheritance that God's given you. There's no priority, there's complete equality between you in Christ's kingdom. They are heirs with you of the grace of life. The inheritance that you both look forward to is life everlastingly, eternal life. It's God's grace, it's God's gift to you. You're not somehow superior to her and have worked your way into it and she's tagged along behind. God's given it to you both freely as a gift, to you and to your wife. You're completely equal. And so show her honour and put her first, and understand her needs and do what's best for her, because you are heirs together of God's grace and of the life he's given you. You two together, he says, should be doing what Peter's already said in chapter 1, setting your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And the second reason is really a warning. He says, make sure you're living in this way towards each other, and particularly husbands towards wives. He says, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Your prayers won't be hindered. As you're both setting your hope for the future on the inheritance that you have, you're both also equally dependent on God now. You're dependent on him, on his answering you when you call to him. And what matters most is your relationship with God as your king. He's the one that you're bringing your prayers to. You as the husband, you as the wife, you're bringing your prayers to him as your king, and that relationship is crucial. What's going to get in the way of that relationship with God? Well, what's going to get in the way of it is when you start trying to fit into the kingdom of the world. Anyone who's a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. If you take your values from the world around you and say, I'm going to be a husband like those husbands over there because they seem to have a great time. I'm going to be a wife like those wives over there because that seems to work really well for them. At that stage, you're not just saying, I'm making an informed choice as to what's best. You're saying, I don't want to do things God's way. I want to align myself with the way that the world operates and the way the world's culture operates. You're saying, as a wife, I don't want to submit to my husband. That sounds boring. I'd much rather do things their way, where they say, I don't care what my husband says, I'm going to do it. Or as a husband, I don't want to honour my wife. I'd much rather go out and live my own life with my own priorities, and I don't care whether I understand her or not. That may sound attractive, but at that point you are saying, I don't want God's kingdom, I want the world's way of doing things. You're trying to fit in. You're trying not to live distinctly in a way that is fearlessly gentle. And so there's a warning here for all of us husbands and for all of the rest of us as well. He's saying that living distinctly is not optional. Why is he talking about your prayers being hindered? Well, we didn't read the rest of this chapter, but we sung Psalm 34 at the beginning. He goes on to quote Psalm 34. Let's just read verse 12 here in chapter 3. He says, "For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." As soon as you're aligning yourself with the world around you, you're aligning yourself with the people who God's face is set against because they're doing evil. If you're aligning yourself with God's ways, what God says to do, even in a very difficult situation, if you're still aligning yourself with that, then you're aligning yourself with God's people, the righteous, and the eyes of the Lord are on you. His ears are open to your prayer. He's delighting to hear you, to listen to you, and that relationship with him as your king and as your redeemer is intact and wonderful and a great blessing to you, as well as honouring to him. So let's hear what we've looked at in these 7 verses of chapter 3. It's not just a lesson on what a great marriage could be like. You look at it and you go, "Oh, that's interesting." Just imagine, if we were that focused on, I was that focused on honouring her, she was that focused on submitting to me. Wouldn't that be interesting? It's not just a lesson on what it could be like. Peter is saying to them and to us, this is what you need to work on today. If you're a husband or a wife. If you're not a husband or a wife, this is what you need to be encouraging other husbands and wives to do, and preparing yourself to do if in future you'll be a husband or a wife. Husbands, what are you going to change in order to better honour your wife? That's what Peter wants his readers in Turkey to think. That's what he wants us here in Sidcup today to think about. Wives, what are you going to change in order to better submit to your husband? Because this is critical in how you obey God and how you show as well. How you show by being fearlessly gentle. In the face of opposition, in the face of a culture that says you're an idiot, how you show where your hope is, that your hope is in Christ, that your hope is in the grace that he will bring to you, in the inheritance which you'll share with all of his people. And as you do this, your aim is that people around you will come to glorify God. Just read verse 11 and 12 of chapter 2 again. "Beloved, I urge you, as sojourners and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh," that's the things I want to do, "which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honourable, good, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." Amen.